Whether you're into cars or not, you should know by now that the Honda Civic is one of the most popular cars in all of automotive history. It appealed to everyone and it promised you to get you anywhere you needed to go. You probably knew someone who had one, or you even had one yourself. It came from humble beginnings to becoming one of the most successful cars of all time. So, how did it become so successful? How did it prove itself to its rear-wheel drive rivals even though it's front-wheel drive? Well, in this episode, we will discover how the Honda Civic proved to everyone that front-wheel drive should be respected. It was the late 60s and Honda already started selling their N and Z600 cars in America. There was a slight problem though. Inventory wasn't moving fast enough. These small cars were powered by a tiny 2-cylinder motorcycle engine. And America being known for V8 powered cars, no one really paid attention to these Honda economy cars. Luckily, during that time, Honda was already developing a replacement for these little cars. That replacement would be called the Civic and would feature a transverse front engine layout like the Mini did over in England. By doing this layout would mean there would be no running gears going to the rear of the car. That meant that there would be more room for passengers and their stuff. It was all going great for Honda during the design phase, but there was a tiny bit of disagreement when it came to the suspension setup of the car. Honda founder Soichiro Honda wanted a solid rear axle for the Civic. He didn't believe that an independent suspension setup would be ideal for the car, but his lead engineer Mamoru Sakata thought otherwise. He had to convince Soichiro Honda that independent suspension was the way to go with this car, especially because it's gonna be a front-wheel drive configuration. Honda would later on approve this idea because he trusted his engineers, and so it was decided that the Civic would have independent suspension at all 4 corners. Honda wanted the Civic to be simple, a great daily driver that was engaging to drive. It would have a high revving engine that would produce 50 horsepower. It wanted to be driven way up in the rev range. You would basically make a lot of noise and feel like you're going really fast without breaking the law. So Honda shipped their Civics to America in 1973, and it didn't exactly capture the hearts of the people. Not yet anyway, until the year after. Federal law said that unleaded gas would be available everywhere in the country. This meant that the dreaded catalytic converter can be added to a car's exhaust without getting clogged up by lead additives. Many manufacturers didn't really like the idea of adding a catalytic converter to the exhaust of their cars, but the government at the time was saying they had to. But Honda wasn't too worried. Why? Because their new CVCC engine that they used in their Civics didn't need a catalytic converter. Honda just didn't trust those catalytic converters, so they made engines that would run cleaner without the help of a cat. Their CVCC engine, or compound vortex controlled combustion engine, would pass emissions even without a catalytic converter. The Civic was ahead of its competitors in America, and people started realizing they didn't need a big block-powered car to get around the city. Everyone started to realize that they can live with something smaller and much more fuel efficient. The Civic would have its first refresh in 1980. Honda wanted to stay at the top of the food chain, and they wanted to outlast the now fading gas crisis. So, to attract a wider market, Honda would pump out 2 more trim levels of the Civic. The DX with a more efficient 5-speed and the GL with more comfort. These were great additions to the Civic lineup, but it still lacked some features. But even then, the Civic was still really comfortable. So by 1981, Honda sold over 1 million Civics. The GL lasted for 3 years until it was discontinued to make room for a more sportier Civic, the Civic S. It featured rear sway bars, stiffer suspension, and better tires. This was Honda's first answer to the hot hatch wall. However, it didn't exactly dominate like the Golf GTI did, so Honda would kill off the Civic S just 1 year after. In 1984, Honda would introduce a new trim that would define the Civic as the choice if you wanted a car that was fun to drive, was reliable, and had great handling, the Si. At the time, it was only available in Japan, and it had more room inside the bonnet for the new dual overhead cam engine. The Si stood for Sport Injection. Civics before this were carbureted, which cut down power, but this particular one made 118 horsepower and could easily do 122 miles an hour. While the Si was being introduced, the CRX was released on the other side of the world, the US. And for those of you that didn't know, the CRX was basically a Civic underneath with a different shell. Honda noticed that the price of oil would keep creeping up, and they wanted a car that could do around 50 miles per gallon and still be engaging to drive. So they made it more aerodynamic and took out the back seats. It was actually a really cool looking car. By 1985, the Si badge would finally arrive in America. This badge would also be on the CRX. It didn't make as much power as its JDM counterpart did, but everyone was still happy to have the Si. The CRX would get upgraded in 1988 with new double wishbone suspension that was inspired by Honda's Formula 1 success with McLaren. This new suspension design made the CRX more fun to drive. The following year, things got more exciting. The CRX would feature a new B16A VTEC engine. This would only be available outside of the US though. The Si was really a true driver's car, and it was a viable option for those who didn't have a lot of money to spend on higher end sports cars but still loved driving. So, fast forward to the 90s and the Civic needed another refresh. In 1992, Honda would introduce another Civic, but this time it had a much smoother design and was more inviting. The EG hatch Civic would be released, and the Si trim made 125 horsepower and featured rear disc brakes. The following year, Honda did something unusual. Honda would introduce the Del Sol, which is again a Civic underneath. It looked unusual but cool. If you wanted a sporty looking Civic with a target top and looked mid-engine but wasn't, this is the one you got. The Del Sol replaced the CRX, and this was Honda's answer to the Miata. But unlike the Miata, the Del Sol would be discontinued in 1997. But that was okay, because 1997 was also the year Honda introduced the sportiest Civic yet, and this time it wore a red badge. In 1997, the world would witness the birth of the Civic Type R, or EK9. This particular Civic was the first ever Civic that was meant to be raced on the track. It had a very simple interior with bolster seats and a Momo steering wheel like an F1 car. It was lighter than a normal Civic and made more power too. The Civic Type R made 182 horsepower from its legendary B16B VTEC engine. It also redlined at 8400 RPM, and it screamed. Sadly, the Type R was only available in Japan, and everyone was pretty bummed about that. So what did the rest of the world do? They started swapping H-Series and B-Series engines in their little Civics, making their own versions of the Type R. This also helped kickstart the now popular tuner scene. A new millennium meant a new Civic needed to be released. It's now on its 7th generation, and the 2001 Civic had new styling and a much more simple suspension setup. The double wishbone suspension will be taken out and would be replaced by struts. The 7th gen Civic also had a Type R, and it would be known as the EP3. It was a hatch like the first Civic Type R and made 212 horsepower from the K20A VTEC engine. Even though the 7th gen wasn't as popular as the 6th generation, everyone loved the EP3 Type R. it's still very popular in places like the UK. They just loved how it drove. The 8th Gen Civic made its debut in 2006, and this was the Civic that people found really boring due to its more toned down design. However, there was an SI version that had stiffer springs, sway bars, and a limited slip differential. Still, no Type R was made for the US, but for the rest of the world, there would be 2 versions. Japan got the FD2 4-door Type R with a K20 that produced 222 horsepower, and Europe got the spaceship-looking FN2 3-door hatch that made 200 horsepower from another version of the K20, the K20Z. After that, the 9th Gen Civic would be introduced later on, and this was kind of the same as the 8th Gen but with everything improved. Fast forward a bit again, and the 10th Gen was released in 2015, and this one had a more improved design. And 2 years later, in 2017, the US finally got a taste of a new Type R, and this would be the best Type R yet. It set a lap record in the Nürburgring, it made over 300 horsepower with a top speed of 170 miles an hour. It's really fast, and even if it's still a front-wheel drive car, there is no torque steer, and it's one of the best handling modern hot hatches up to date. The FK8 Civic Type R is pretty much the best Civic ever made. And I know there is a new 2022 Civic Type R coming out very soon, but we still don't know for sure if it's going to be better than the FK8 Type R. Throughout the history of the automotive industry, there were a lot of cars that made an impact. The Skyline, the Supra, Nissan Z, Celica, Evos, STIs, and so on. But what made the Civic stand out from all of them? Simple. There was a Civic for everyone, and even though it wasn't rear-wheel drive like the rest of the cars I mentioned, the Civic did prove that even with a front-wheel drive setup, it can still leave a mark in history as one of the greatest cars ever made. Now, my question to you. What are your thoughts on the new 2022 Civic Type R? Do you think that it will be better than the FK8 Civic Type R? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you loved this video and you're a Honda fan, I'm sure you will love the video essay/documentary I made last time on how the Honda S2000 became an icon. And with that being said, thanks for watching.